Okay, so where we last left off on our project, we were starting to retrieve the data to display on screen. This comic data, we're starting to retrieve it. So let me load up a project, save a couple of comics, and then remind you the underlying concepts at the moment to then further add to the code. Also, I had a little misspelling in my code that it wasn't saving the publisher info, so I'll point that out where to fix that in a moment if you need it. So I will create an account. Sign in with that account. I'll save some comics. I'll put some stuff in the notes and the publisher because we want to eventually see and edit this stuff. So I'm going to put something in each of these fields. View comics. Okay, I'm starting to see the couple of comics I just saved. You saw that I saved Zed-Man first and then Catwoman second, but then it alphabetized it properly. Okay, we saw that before. And then all of our code here is, we've got two items, there's two comics, run the code, and we have show comics table. Okay, the last thing that we did was you click on the little speech bubble, and we're starting the process about show comics info is running. So a brand new function is starting to run to make a pop-up to display the details of each comic. And in my case here, out of these two comics that I clicked on, I clicked on a particular row that has inside of the JSON data here, the object, that row that I clicked on, there happens to be somewhere there data set. There's an ID, data ID of the particular row I clicked on. So within all of that object data that it returns to you, it gives you that info. So if I click on the other comic inside of that object, if I kind of dig down through the levels in this, the 0th entry there, scrolling down, in a couple of places, one of the places it says right here, dataset, there is an ID on that row. And I did click on that comic, and that has a particular ID. Via that ID, then, we can continue our code to make a pop-up happen to display all of the information of that comic, including the publisher and notes and the year and such. Better yet, that pop-up will happen with the functionality to edit the comic. Well, I put gibberish into a few spots. I want to fix that. Or maybe delete the comic. I don't have that comic in the collection anymore. I want to delete it. So the pop-up will have multiple purposes. First, to fix my issue that my publisher info was not being saved, you want to check this yourself as well, just in case. There was a line over here that I misspelled publisher. Publisher. Yep. So in my case, it's line 300, but the place that it's at is in the function prep comic. This is the function that starts to read those input fields. I'm about to save a comic. It has a variety of input fields. Let's get the values of each of those input fields, create variables out of them so that later on we can put the info together. And I didn't get any error messages at all this whole time, and that was something we did, 2 weeks ago at least. So this was, in theory, not a syntax error. It was more of a logic error. Sometimes you get an error that it does tell you, well, object unknown or whatever. But in this case, in theory, it's saying, let's go search for some object or some HTML node that has an ID of in publisher, which doesn't exist. But there could be something there, so I guess I didn't quite get any feedback that it didn't work. But that's what my issue is. If yours says publisher, that's not quite right. Publisher. In my case, we'll fix the issue that I wasn't saving my publisher info to the database because there was no value to retrieve out of this supposed input field to save it into this object. It saved it as undefined, and so there was no data. There was undefined data that we were trying to save into the database. So confirm that's not wrong like mine, and then we'll go on. So I want to click the speech bubble, make a pop-up happen on screen with all of the info of the comic. That pop-up on screen is a visual element that the user does have to see and interact with. So we have a couple of ways to create it. We can write it in just classic HTML to make a little screen. We can also write it in JavaScript a little bit more dynamically with a little bit more setup. We'll do it the way that we've done it before in terms of an HTML screen. So we'll go over to our HTML file, index.html. We'll get a little practice writing some of the interface code again. We need a brand new pop-up screen. So at the very end of our code, we've got a template that might help us. Yeah, that template's a little too much because it has a nav and footer and all that stuff, so we'll just write it manually. So above the template, we have a section that ends our options screen. Let's make a new section. Let's make a new HTML node. Let's make a new screen in HTML that will be the pop-up that will appear once you click on the speech bubble. So we'll do our notes here that this is start pop view comics info. In between we will have the code, but then we've got also the end. In between will be a section. So this pop-up screen will be another delineated section of our document data role, so that it has meaning beyond just the basic, this is a separate section of content, so that it has a visual meaning, semantic meaning. This is also going to be a page full of content. It needs an ID. I already mentioned up here what it's going to be, so I'll just copy that. Pop view comics info. So instead of PG that we used over and over, that it's a whole page, a whole screen, I'm just using the nomenclature of pop, as this is a pop-up screen. So as I browse my code quickly, oh, this is prefixed with pop, so that means it's going to be more of a pop-up screen than a full screen. We'll put a header and an article, but not a footer. I don't really need the bottom footer area. It's going to be a pop-up. I want a top header so that the user sees what this little pop-up is about. It gives it a label, a name at the header, but I'm not putting a footer. Header tag, in order for it to behave like a header, needs a data role. Of header. And then some message in here as an H1. We'll say comic info. This little pop-up displays the comics info. Article was a special case that it's simply a role instead of a data role, and that it has a class so that it's not transparent of UI-content. And just for the moment, we'll put XYZ. Nothing special. I just want to confirm that I'm able to make this pop up, because we're going to make it pop up programmatically. We're going to make it pop up via JavaScript as a reaction to something, rather than the plain old, I'm going to press this button, instead of the classic, I'm going to press this button and I get a direct action. Well, this pop-up happens after we save comics and then go to the table and click the little speech bubble, and it prepares the comic data and then displays the pop-up. So we're going to get to see this screen in a slightly different way. Once you confirm that's working, once you confirm you've written that, we'll confirm that it's working soon. But once you've written that, you can save it, and we'll jump back over to the JavaScript. But that should look familiar. This is a way to create an interface. We've got a section, it's a page full of content, it's got a header, footer, basic stuff. We've seen that before. We'll get back to the JavaScript. Near the end of our code, on the last function we started to work with, function show comics info, up to this point, we just have some console log output that we're confirming that this stuff is working so far, which is the function is running at least. We've passed data into the function, and we know specifically the data-ID of the particular row that this comic is in. That's what we had previously. We didn't write any notes on that, so let's write a quick note. Display the data-ID attribute of this row this row that you clicked on, and this came from down at the bottom where we had the event listener. I can't show them at once just yet, but this, remember we had we're running a function and we're using the jQuery selector this. This represents literally this thing that you clicked on, this object. It's selecting this object. And so when we pass the data into the function, we're referring to it as this comic. And then we can check the data-whatever attribute, specifically data-ID. If I wanted to check, what's the data role of this particular thing I clicked on, we say data-role, and that would pull the role. But right now we care about the ID. And to confirm that that pop-up can appear, we'll do the something.pageContainer something. Remember this when we wanted to write some code to move from one screen to another. When we originally had PG welcome and we had to go to PG sign up, or when we're on nowadays when we're on PG welcome and we do the login to go to PG home, we have this code to move us from screen to screen. Remember this. So we've got the mobile page container. So from the current screen, we're going to change over to another screen with a slight difference, because we're not going to move like from one whole big screen to another. We're going to make a pop-up happen. But the code is very similar that we've seen before. We're going to change, comma, to where, well, we have to create our object as well. Yeah, we'll do that in a moment. Pop view comic. Oh no, that's going to work. Comics info. So, oops, chnage, the alternate spelling. Change. We're going to change from the current page over to this other pop-up, to this other screen, the one we just made. Pop view comics info. Now let me triple check that I put singular versus plural, because I'm going to forget that easily. Comics info, good. And here, comics info. I'll just copy and paste to make sure. Don't forget the pound sign, because that section has an ID, and we refer to it by its ID, which is a pound sign in the JavaScript world. So here, this is code we've seen before. Starting on our current screen, let's change over to some other screen. But now, comma, we'll have some options in terms of don't just change over to this brand new screen. Instead, make it behave, make it be like a pop-up, make it appear on screen like a pop-up. So previously we used the transition and then flip or whatever. I want instead role : dialog. We're passing in also the option, I want to change to this screen in a way that it looks like a dialog box. The default is that it's a whole screen full of content. It takes over the whole screen. I want it as a little pop-up to happen in the middle of the screen. This should be enough to test to see that if we click on some of those speech bubbles, we should get the pop-up to happen. It's not going to be filled in yet. It'll say XYZ. That's all we told it to say so far. But give that a try. Save it and run it. Click on some of those speech bubbles of your comics. You should have 2 or 3 of them. And make the pop-up happen. And we'll start to fill in the details of the pop-up. So the spelling there, of course, is very particular. We have the :mobile at the beginning. That's one of the very few places you ever see that. You always either see the pound sign for the ID or the dot for the class. We have these pseudo selectors. One is mobile page container. Okay, so I'm going to run mine just to confirm. I should get a pop-up. When I view comics, click that, get a pop-up. It automatically has built in the pop animation, and then when I close it, it animates. And it automatically also has a close button. All of that is coming from the role of that section being set to dialog. It has a built-in features of a pop-up animation and a close button. Okay, so that makes the pop-up. The pop-up is pretty empty. The pop-up is where we're going to see the details of the comic, the title, the year, publisher, etc., and where we're going to edit the comic or delete the comic. So we've got to go back to our HTML file to put in a couple of placeholders, which will then be filled in with all of the particular info of a comic. So back to the HTML file. Okay, so in the article I had XYZ. Remove that. That was just a quick placeholder. I'm going to create a div, a generic container, where we will put a variety of placeholders, and we need an ID here so that via JavaScript we can refer to and be able to target and change or view the contents of this. Call this div view comics. This div is about viewing the comics. This generic placeholder is about viewing the comics. We're going to have a paragraph where we're going to have the title of the comic, a paragraph for the number of the comic, and all of the fields, year of the comic, publisher, notes, we haven't gotten there just yet, but we'll put it in right here anyway. Barcode. I want to display the barcode info of the comic and the image of the comic, which we haven't done that one yet. We'll just set it up as having a source to nowhere just yet. I think we'll be all right. Just going to do a little quick complaining there. Just ignore that. Okay, well, I also want the ability to be able to edit or delete the comic. So we can create a quick button that's not tied to a big old form where we need to do very much complexity. So this will just be a button to delete. If we want each button to be separate on its own block, we can put it in a paragraph so that it's separate. If we want it on the same line, we can do it a little differently. But in my case, visually, what I want to do is separate it into multiple, one button on one line, one on another. This will be edit. These buttons need unique IDs. We could throw in some icons as well, data-icon, whatever. We can throw in some icons. Right now they won't have an icon. They'll look like buttons because we use the button tag. If we had done it the old way about it's an A tag, then we need a data role button and so forth. But we have the basic button tag. But we need an ID for each of these. BTN delete comic and BTN edit comic. We have all of these placeholders. Each item will be in its own line, in its own paragraph. We have a parent div that everything exists in. We will be able to then target each one of these and fill in the appropriate thing as necessary because we have all of this data. And we're going to have notes, or we're going to have barcode and image eventually, so might as well put it here at the moment. You can save it and run it just to see what it looks like, just to confirm that nothing quite broke in the code. So let me get back to that in a moment. Let me just run my code. If I view comic, click any comic, you get the pop-up, title number, year, publisher, notes, barcode, broken image, of course, there's no image to display, delete button, which does nothing yet, edit button, which does nothing yet. That's the code so far. So this is going to be pretty cool once we have a particular comic, how we will be able to populate each one of these. And then better yet, I'll be able to click edit and edit an individual field. These HTML nodes must be turned into JavaScript objects so that when we press the button to delete, an event listener kicks off to run a function to delete the comic. Or when I press the edit button, the JavaScript event listener then runs a function to edit the comic. So let's go back to our JavaScript. Let's go back to our block where we've got all of our variables. And let's create a couple of variables for those objects based on those nodes. Based on what we've done already several times, we should have a good idea of how we're about to do this. So btn delete and btn edit. I'll do Control Home to go back to the beginning of our code here. We've got all of these variables so far. Make a new little block here. Variables to edit, delete a comic. So var dollar $LBTN delete comic is equal to quotes pound BTN delete comic. There's another example, easy to forget. That's the jQuery selector needs to go find an ID. Don't forget the pound sign, comma, $LBTN edit comic is equal to jQuery selector pound BTN edit comic, and then end of statement. While we're here, we're going to put another variable that will help us a little bit later. This is the part about the logic of it, that okay, I use a particular app and it makes sense that here's a comic, I'm going to tap on it and I will be able to delete it. It knows what to do. No, someone had to program it to know what to do. Someone needed to program it to have it keep track of important things. So we need to create a variable that keeps track of the particular comic we are going to edit or delete. Because we want to be able to either edit it or delete it, I'm going to create a global scope variable to keep track of that throughout the app. If we had created variables in a function, we might not be able to use that variable anywhere else because it's in a function. It's local scope. Instead, we're going to create a variable that we can use to keep track of the comic throughout the app. So let's say global scope variable to keep track of the comic to work with. So var. Now, the naming of all of these things, in my notes I have it a certain way, but I'm going to change it slightly, which I think makes more sense. And also, we've been using the $L over and over. I'm not going to use that this time because we were using $L over and over to delineate something that this is a variable based on an element of HTML. This is not that. So we can continue to use $EL. It's just that the logic of it doesn't make sense to me. You know, comic to edit. Don't type this yet. But this is not going to be based on an HTML node, so it's not technically an element. So either or, keep using the same naming over and over, but the logic of it to me is not that. I'm not going to use that, so I'm going to call this comic WIP, work in progress. Lowercase right there. Comic work in progress. Previously, on previous classes, I had called it temp comic to delete. And that would make sense right now, because one of the first things we will do is, let's set up the functionality to delete a comic. But then we're also going to set up the functionality to edit a comic. And we were using the same variable, temp comic to delete. That same named variable even when we were simply going to edit the comic. So people thought it was a little confusing. Why are we using a variable called delete comic if we're editing the comic? Well, again, the variable could be called kitty cat, and it'll work fine. So I'm going to try it this time. I'm going to call it comic work in progress. This is the comic that we're going to work with, either to edit it or delete it. And I'm not putting the $EL. You could, it'll work just fine, but I'm not making that variable based on an HTML node. So I'll write it in the notes in a moment. And also, we're not going to define it as anything just yet. We can't assign it anything just yet. Global scope variable to keep track of a comic to work with. Note, it's undefined. So not assigned anything yet. Note, purely for naming. No $L because it's not based on HTML element or node. Okay, so we've set up a couple new variables, one related to pressing buttons and one related to a comic that we're working with. We need to create a couple of event listeners for deleting and editing. There's a couple of buttons that once you press them, something should happen. Well, that something comes from the event listeners. Let's go down to our block of code where we've got all of our event listeners and set up some event listeners for those. So control end. So event, this is near the end, before the end of on-device ready. Event listeners for editing, deleting a comic. So $L btn delete comic, we'll do that one first. On the event of a click, we're going to run a function. This one's going to be a simple one where we don't need to pass in a bunch of data. So it'll be kind of like the syntax of line 577 or 78, that it's just the named function. We don't need to have the anonymous function to pass some data in just yet. So we'll make up these functions, of course, fn delete comic. So L button delete comic. On the event of clicking, run the function delete comic. And then just about the same thing for then edit comic. On click, run a function to edit comic. We're then going to create these two functions at once. We're going to work on delete comic first and then edit comic, but we need both of them defined at the moment, or else we'll get errors, because it says, okay, you're going to click something and run a function, which doesn't exist. We could comment it out until we get to it, but we might as well create both of those functions, just their basic skeleton of them. Then we also have to show on screen the comic info, and then we've got delete and edit. But let's back up then to create the delete and edit functions. Now be careful here, this has happened to a few people. Remember to do this after the end of your last function. So you want to make sure you're after the final curly brace, but still within your block of functions. Function fn delete comic. Function fn edit comic. Comic singular. The usual sort of boilerplate to help yourself out code-wise, and then also the usual console log just to confirm that when you click the button it reacts. Function delete comic is running. So basic skeletons for those two functions. We still need to complete our function for show the comics info. We'll do that in a moment. But just for completeness at the moment, we're going to have some buttons that appear on screen, edit and delete. In the console, when you click on either one, you should get some reaction. So that at the very least, if you're getting some reaction in the console, you're on the right track. So try to save that and run it and see if you get any of that simple feedback. So just to test this, I'll go to my view comics. I've got a couple of comics saved. I click on one. I have the pop-up on screen, which I expect. And then I've got the delete button. Click that. Delete comic is running. Click on edit. Edit is running. Okay, so in order for delete or edit to actually do anything, we need to complete show comics. Let's back up to our show comics. We have to leave this line as the final line of this function because logically we're going to populate all of those paragraphs and then show the pop-up. So it won't be a big deal if you put it out of order, but do you see the logic of it? Let's display the pop-up once the pop-up has been completed. The pop-up will be filled in within these lines. So I'm leaving that as my final line before the end of the function. We need to do a little bit of setup. We'll save a variable to keep track of the current comic to display. var temp comic is equal to. So within this variable, we're going to keep track of the comic in question. And the comic in question is based on a particular ID. So up here in the console where I simply showed this is the comic we're working with. Here's the ID of the comic we're working with. Okay, well we need to store that a little bit more permanently. That's why I've got this variable. So this comic dot data attribute ID check the data-id attribute of this row that I clicked on and store it in a variable to work with. And pass that info back to the global scope variable. The global scope variable, the one that's going to keep track of it outside of the function we created a little while ago, was comic WIP, work in progress. We will assign that whatever is currently in temp comic. So we're going to keep track of the comic to do stuff with it in this function, but then we also want to pass it back to the rest of the app to do other things with it, the work in progress comic. So we don't have var here at the beginning, of course. That's only if we were creating a variable. We've already created it back on line 12 or whatever. Here we're now assigning it something. Previously we had it unassigned, it was undefined, but then now we've actually passed that value back to it. Retrieve all the fields of the comic in question and display them in the placeholders. Temp comic is the ID, underscore ID, of the comic in question. So we can db.get. This expects some underscore ID here. That underscore ID is inside of temp comic. So I want to get all of the information of a particular comic. The particular comic's ID is in this variable. We always have the failure or success when we're trying to do anything in pouch. So we'll have what we've seen before, an anonymous function, opening, closing parentheses and curly braces. Then we have the failure, comma, success. Then we have, in the event of a failure or success, the if-else part. Do stuff. So we have either a failure or a success. This is where I'm going to break apart the curly braces of the of that anonymous function, because it's going to be several lines that take care of a possibility of failure or success, a condition of failure or success. So I'll break those apart and make my note that is end.get a comic. If we have something, or else we have something else. And if else dot get, if failure, as we've done before when we tried to save something to the database, db.put, we had a failure or success. When we tried to delete the whole database, db.destroy, we had a failure or success. Now, trying to retrieve from the database could be a failure or success. We've programmed it in such a way so far that we really shouldn't get a failure, because it's based on the ID of the row, and we already confirmed and set it up previously that the proper ID is embedded into the proper row. But just to be complete, we have a failure to deal with, or a success. And we'll put the console as usual to say error getting the comic, and then output the message. We can say success getting the comic, specifically success title. Success, when we try to db.get, when we try to get a comic, it then should return it to us as the whole object, the whole entry, which has title, publisher, year, barcode, photo, etc. So the title property, the title field, is one of the fields in our database of a particular document, of a particular entry. So I'm being more specific. Success getting the comic, Catwoman. I'm showing the title of the particular object, of the particular entry in my console. Save it and run it at this point, and let's confirm some of these consoles and check for errors. We should see these console messages. If you click on one of those comics in your console, you'll either get the error or the success here. I'll be very surprised if you get a failure, because again, we've gone through it deep enough that ID should be defined. It should not somehow lose track of the ID.
So some of the fields should be filled, or all of them?
None of the fields are filled yet. We haven't told it to write anything on screen yet. We're just confirming the console. Question? Just F12, open your F12 console and confirm that these messages are appearing there when you interact. Let me confirm mine. Let me run that. Nothing will appear on screen again. We haven't written any code just yet. It's just in the console. We see that it is a little bit of a gradual process, just to confirm the logic of it all. I'm going to view a comic. I'm also going to clear my console. I kind of like to clear it once in a while when this gets way too busy, so you can go up here to clear that. Optional, but I clicked on this item, and all that it should really say is, well, we've seen this before. We're running show comics. Okay, we did that before. Specifically on this row, you can go in to see there's a row in there. And then we had the ID of this row is that. We saw that before. This is the new part. Success, getting the comic, Catwoman. So it's showing me the title, all spelled properly, of a particular entry to my database, which was the Catwoman one. Nothing appears on screen here. And then if I try my other comic, click on that, this pops up here. Again, the usual, and the final thing, it's getting that comic. So because it should all work, it's all dynamic, I'm going to save a brand new comic, The Incredible. Anyway, I can, if let's say I misspelled it, I'll fix it later. We're going to have that functionality. Incredible Hulk. Number 1, 1963, Marvel, and then gibberish. I'll fix that later. We're going to edit. We're going to set up edit capability. So that should all work as before. I've got 3 comics in my database. Better yet, I can view 3 comics. Notice also this table is growing, and if you didn't notice, this table is growing and shrinking based on the data inside of it. I want to control that, of course, via CSS. I want it to be all nice and uniform and nicely colored. I want it to have, zebra striping, that one row has one color and then alternating for readability. I want to center that. I want to space that. We'll do all of that via CSS. But right now, I'm getting data on my table. And then this brand new comic that I added, tap on that, get the pop-up. Nothing happens on screen yet. We're not there yet. But in the console, it says we're getting the comic, The Incredible Hulk. That's what it should do at this point. We'll make it display these items, then we'll take a break, because I want to start to see stuff on screen, and if I see it enough this far in the console, I'm very close to displaying it on screen. But you see the logic of what we're doing. There is a command, a method in Pouch that lets me get all of the info of one particular comic. Once I've confirmed successfully that, yeah, I'm retrieving a comic, it's time to display it on screen. Okay, so for our note here, this is in the else. We've confirmed success. We are retrieving the data. Our note here is now display each property or field of the object, the document, the comic. Now display each property in the appropriate placeholder paragraph. We've got paragraphs that we made in the HTML file that hold each of those fields. So now we're going to put it in each one of them. The jQuery selector to find an instance of div view comics info. In the HTML file, we've got a parent div. Remember that I mentioned. And we can write some HTML, such as success.title. In the console, I've confirmed that I'm showing the title of the comic. Okay, well now on screen I want to write some HTML here to display the title of the comic. And just to confirm this should be coming from our HTML file. In the HTML file, div view comics is the parent. Oops, I called it div view comics info. See, there you go. Double check your code. Div view comics, that's what I'm calling the parent div, where all of these sub-paragraphs are in, these child nodes of this parent element. I'm targeting this whole little block, and then I'm going to put the title in this one, in this paragraph. So that's div view comics, not view comics info. Sorry, div view comics. The problem is, technically what I'm saying here is, go to this div and replace everything there with the title. So all of those other paragraphs are going to get removed. I have to be more specific here. We have the ability, and I'll write the notes in a moment, to specify which paragraph. Because in my case, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I have 7 paragraphs in this div. We have a way via JavaScript or jQuery to specify which of those paragraphs. I want to target specifically paragraph number 1 in this div, paragraph number 4 in this div. Guess what? It starts counting by what? 0. So 0th paragraph, paragraph 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yep.
So you don't need to use IDs in them, you just get over.
We could do it via IDs, but here I'm showing another way to do this that accomplishes the same thing, but I'm showing this in that we can select things that are in a sequence just by their numeric sequence. But another way to do it is, yeah, we could put an ID to each one of them as well, and it'll work as we've always done it before. But I just want to show a slightly different way. It's just another way to do it. The way we would do that is, okay, inside of this selector, we're going to do something brand new. We're saying right here, jQuery is going to search for something with an ID of this. And, so there's a space here. In this case, spaces really, really matter. There's a space there. Paragraph. Go search for, I would read it right to left. Go search for a paragraph inside of this. And I'll write the notes in a moment. Well, we've got 6 paragraphs, 7 paragraphs. Okay, then we specifically then say colon EQ equals 0. Reading right to left. There is a paragraph that equals number 0 inside of a div. Then we'll write some HTML there. Okay, same thing for the next one. Search for an ID of div view comics, and then search inside of that for a paragraph equaling 1, and then write some HTML there, specifically the comic books number. Did number a second one, right? Yeah, number. You see what we're getting at here, and then then go find paragraph equaling 2, success dot year, and then the next. Now, yes, of course, we can still also do things in another way in terms of, well, I have to write it manually, and I have to write it 6 times. We can use the magic of copy and paste to do it a little faster. But yes, we could also write a loop or some other algorithm that kind of goes through it sequentially. That's another thing we could possibly do. Again, the great thing about programming is there's just so many ways to do it. The bad thing about programming is there's just so many ways to do it. So whichever way makes sense, whichever way is elegant, whichever way is efficient, whichever way you like.
Is success an array? Like you can get things like it's also like
Success at the moment is not an array. It is an instance of one particular comic. At a higher level in our code, when we get db.alldocs, that one is an array. It has the sequence of comics, but right now success is one single comic. Okay, so here's where I'm going to copy and paste a little bit. 3. Yes. Publisher is next. And then on 4, or the 5th one, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, the 5th one, we have notes. We don't have a barcode to display or a picture to display. To do, something that we will to do is display barcode and display image. The code will be very similar, but there's no data just there yet. So we'll get something that says undefined. So it's either show it as undefined right now and live with that until we get to the barcode scanner, or don't put that in, but then we have to come back and add it eventually. Both paths will give us the same result. I'll just put the note here as we've done before that. It's something that we need to do eventually. Okay, now save it and run it. Now we started to tell it to show something on screen. The .html method of jQuery is designed to write HTML at a certain location, and there we've got 5 locations in HTML where we're writing some HTML, specifically title, number, year, etc., of the current object, the current one comic. Do you see a result? Do you like the result? Exactly. It removed what was already there. We'll fix that in a moment. But this, again, is doing exactly what we told it. Let's write some HTML inside of this paragraph. Well, there was already HTML, so it removed it, and it wrote some new HTML. We have methods to add to what's already there, or replace what's there, and they both have a place, and we'll do one in a moment. But let me just confirm mine works. But yes, notice that it replaces what originally was there. So view the comic, make a pop-up showing the particular items. Barcode is intact because we never wrote anything on that paragraph, so it still says barcode. But it removed the placeholder text of title and year and all of that. Well, what's cool about this is because this is this HTML method lets you write any valid HTML. What if we do something like this? What if we write title? What if we write some HTML here? Obviously, we can write it in the other document. But here now, I'm going to write the title bold and then display it on screen. What if we wanted to do other things, like also, don't do this one, but what if we wanted to attach a class, styling, text. Don't write this, so I'm going to take it out. But what I'm showing here is .html method accepts valid strings containing HTML code. So all of this would be processed as HTML. And so now I'm doing something that the original HTML document didn't have. I'm putting the title back in, but also making it bold. This is another case of either or. Either I can set this up in the HTML file, or I can set it up in the JavaScript file. In the JavaScript file, little copy and paste here. Number, yeah, don't forget this sort of stuff here. Colon space, all of that will appear literally. If you don't put that extra space in that quote, it'll put title, no space, and then the title. So this is just a little polish to remember. Here, so exactly as I write it here, these will be bold with the space and colon, and then display on screen. Now, all of these replace existing HTML and add some new HTML. There are methods to append or add to what already exists. The problem with that is it will literally keep adding to what already exists. So if you already had it saying Spider-Man, and you click on another comic, it'll add Catwoman next to Spider-Man. And you click on Iron Man, and it'll add Iron Man next to Catwoman next to Spider-Man. So that requires that we clean out what's already there and then display the new thing. So it's almost like though this will just automatically clean out that paragraph and add the new text. Yes, we have to rewrite our title, so it's a little redundant. But the other way is if we add to what's already there, we have to first make sure what's already there makes sense before we add to what's already there. So display each property of the object in the appropriate placeholder. Say note, jQuery selector is more specific. What's that?
Number. Strong number.
Strong. Nubner. Well, it's a good thing that it's only a string. Okay, so anyway, the note here, jQuery selector is more specific. Note that there is a space between them because we've got a child, we've got a descendant, we've got something inside of something. So I guess we could say it's kind of saying find an ID, then find a paragraph equaling X. So the spacing here is very important because this is a string. It's literally looking for this, and I like to often read it from right to left. There's a paragraph equaling 4, 1, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, the fifth one inside of this one. And we can get pretty specific. We will need to get a little bit more specific when the time comes for the image, because then there's an image inside of a thing inside of a thing. So we'll get to that eventually, but do you see that eventually we're going to set the source attribute of an image inside of a paragraph inside of a div? So we'll eventually have something like pound div view comics space paragraph equaling 6 space image and more. So when we do the image eventually, it'll be related to that but slightly different. Let's save it and run it. We'll do a break in just a moment to confirm all the code works. Question?
Could you just go down to that Sigma?
Let me check my code works, and then we're about to do a break, and then we'll confirm that. So let's see here. I'm going to view comic Catwoman, pop up. It starts to fill in. The title is bold and so forth, not barcode. Well, we never dealt with it in the JavaScript. It's still plain. Fine. But then I go to another comic. Incredible Hulk pops up there. Great. It's all popping up. I want to edit those notes. I want to put real notes. Edit doesn't do anything except just to say we're about to run it. We'll take a break. When we come back, we'll start to make these things work. Let's confirm that so far we're able to finally start to display the stuff on screen.